At im2moro, we focus on education and principles. We believe that most every problem we face in our nation today, whether it be Occupy protests, the national debt, rising unemployment, or the mortgage crisis, can be traced back to a departure from the first principles of our framers. Thoreau said, "There are thousands hacking at the branches, to the one striking at the root." At im2moro, we are root strikers, and we believe one of the root causes of these harms was our nation's move in 1913 from the principle of sound money to the Federal Reserve System. In the next few moments, I'd like to pull back the curtain and expose the mysterious Federal Reserve System, help you understand how it negatively impacts your life, and finally share the benefits to be gained by returning back to the principle of sound money. But first, a few questions for you. Do you know anyone who has lost their home or their job in recent years due to the recession? Some of you may be old enough to remember penny candy. Why does a piece of candy that cost a penny in the 1970s now cost 25 cents? Is a candy today 25 times bigger than it was in the 50s? Or how about a gallon of gas? In the 50s, gas was for about 25 cents per gallon. And today, gas can be bought for around $4. Is a gallon today 16 times bigger than it was in the 50s? Of course not. The reason why prices keep rising is because the purchasing power of our dollar keeps declining. It's the simple result of the economic law of supply and demand. The greater supply we have of something, the lower its value. Ever since 1913 and the establishment of the Federal Reserve, the dollar has lost 95% of its purchasing power. Now, what would you do if you owned a business and the money being used in exchange for your products and services was being systematically destroyed? Wouldn't you react by raising your prices? Or better yet, what if someone came and stole 95% of your savings? I bet you would call the police. But what if that someone was the government? Thoreau exhorted us to strike at the root. So let's spend the next few moments to strike at the root of the problem, the mysterious Federal Reserve and the endless running of the printing presses. Many of you might be surprised to learn that the Federal Reserve isn't any more federal than the Federal Express. And not only that, it doesn't have any reserves. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913 without any constitutional authority and is privately owned. Now, how would you like to be the owner of a bank whose customers weren't just moms and dads buying cars, but whose customer was the largest government in history? The Federal Reserve is nothing more than a government-granted monopoly to a select few to print money. And most of us couldn't conceive why our own government would grant a monopoly over any industry, let alone one as powerful as money. But history shows us they did just that. Now, some of you might be also asking, why would lawmakers do such a thing? Well, their intentions might have been good, but I'm not sure they understood what they were doing. You see, prior to 1913, we wanted a monetary system that more closely followed the Constitution. That is one based upon gold and silver, and not just green paper. There were limits on how much money could be printed, because the dollar was partially redeemable in gold. For every dollar, there had to be some gold to back it. Now, because the population of America was going quicker than the supply of gold, interest rates naturally increased. This created incentives for individuals and businesses to save. Having more savings made Americans less dependent on banks for financing. This, combined with the growth of America westward and the new independent banks, cut the market share of the large New York banks in half. As a result, money and power began to move away from the large New York banking elite. The Federal Reserve was just a shrewd response of the New York bankers to a naive public. The banking families falsely promised economic stability, while enabling themselves to gain control over the finances of our nation. It should also be noted here that when the Federal Reserve was given this monopoly, the constitutional limits on the size of the government began to crumble. How much would your children spend if they were given a credit card without a limit? I think Reagan hit it on the head when he said, well, you know, we can lecture our children about their extravagance until we run out of voice and breath. Or we can cure their extravagance by simply reducing their allowance. Giving Congress an unlimited source of funding to provide for an insatiable demand for government services has been a recipe for disaster. Don't you think it's time to reduce their allowance? It's time to address the source of this extravagance and return to the currency of the Constitution, gold and silver. Well, we were warned, but we didn't listen. Jefferson said, if we ever allow the banks to control the issue of our currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks will deprive the American people of all their property until their children wake up homeless. Sounds a lot like America today. Again, I ask you, do you know anyone who has lost their home in this recession? Maybe Jefferson knew of that which he spoke. So what happens when a group of private bankers is given a monopoly over the printing of money? Why, they print more, of course. It becomes a giant credit card for Congress. A credit card without a limit. And that's what inflation is. Inflation isn't rising prices. Rising prices are the result of inflation. It's very important that we understand this. If we think that inflation is rising prices, then we put all the blame on the store owner. However, if we understand economics correctly and define inflation as the increase in the money supply, then we put all the blame where it belongs. The root of the problem, the Federal Reserve. This is why penny candy became 25 cents and a gallon of gas became $4. Now, another name for printing money without gold backing is counterfeiting. Not only did George Washington make this a crime punishable by death, but God caused a fraudulent manipulation of weights and measures detestable. You can find that in Deuteronomy 25. Now, the destruction of the purchasing power of our dollar is also a gigantic hidden tax. Not only are Americans being caught holding the bag for the trillions of dollars used to bail out Wall Street, but they are also paying a hidden tax in the form of inflation. Americans are taxed two ways. First, openly by the IRS, and then a second time secretly by the Fed. One directly takes in the front pocket, while the second secretly takes in the back. Now, one group hurt by the devastating impacts of inflation is our families. The declining purchasing power of our dollar has caused fathers to work longer hours. If that isn't bad enough, more and more of our moms have had to leave their children to enter the workforce as well. In 1970, 3 out of 10 moms were in the workforce. By 2006, that number had more than doubled to 71%. Now, many can recognize when someone is ill, but it takes a doctor to recognize the cause and to diagnose the cure. We just like that the cause of our problems and the negative impacts of inflation move away from sound money to the Federal Reserve System. Now, what about the cure and the benefits? Well, the cure is simple. It is returned to the sound money system established by our founders in Article 1, Section 10 of our Constitution. Quote, "No state shall make anything but gold and silver coin, a tender in payment for debt." This is the law of the land. And until our nation is conquered by a foreign power, or we, the people, amend the Constitution, it is still the highest law of the land. This will accomplish three things. One, sound money will put a check on the growth of government. Since without printing presses, Congress will be deprived of the means to pay for any unconstitutional programs. These needs would have to be addressed at the state level where there is greater accountability. Prior to the creation of the Federal Reserve and the subsequent growth of our government, Americans didn't even have an income tax. Two, sound money will put a check on inflation. Since the science of alchemy has yet to discover how to counterfeit gold, our money supply will be restricted from growing and being inflated. Our dollars will once again become a sound store of value. And finally, number three, sound money will encourage saving. With the fixed money supply comes higher interest rates. Higher interest rates encourage us to save. Higher savings translates to increased capital for businesses. And more capital for business translates into increased productivity, lower prices, greater prosperity, and more jobs. Remember, each of our lawmakers have taken a solemn oath to preserve, protect, and defend our Constitution and need to be held accountable. We not only wish the Fed to be audited, we wish to abolish it. Yes, our lawmakers have made some poor decisions, but they were ultimately elected at our consent. This principle needs to be upheld so that we can ultimately glorify our God and pave a way for return to a more prosperous times. We're faced with a choice. We can either be part of the problem by electing candidates who won't apply this principle, or we can be part of the solution by supporting those who do. When the people lead, the leaders will follow. We need to strike at the root. Will you join me? I am tomorrow, but we need your help today.